Hello and welcome. My name is Carol Carter and I'm the founder and CEO of Global Minded. And for those of you who don't know, Global Minded is about creating a capable, diverse talent pipeline to get more women, people of color, and underrepresented populations into the education, economic mobility, and leadership pipeline. We accomplish this in a number of different ways. One is through our annual conference, which last year and this year is virtual. Next year in 2022, it will be back in Denver live the third week of June. And we also have leadership programs for first generation to college student leaders. We have a daily newsletter that is read by about 15,000 people a day, where we focus on a lot of role models for first gen and underrepresented students. So people from all different backgrounds, many of them are first generation. And then we have monthly equity events across the different disciplines. And finally, we have our Global Minded Inclusive Leader Awards across 15 industry sectors. And we feel strongly that until the diversity and inclusion experts are known to the world and are as well known as sports stars and movie stars, we're not going to have the diversity and inclusion knowledge and role models that we need to have across the areas. So those are the ways we accomplish our goals. We are in the middle of our 10-week conference right now, our virtual event, and we're really delighted. This week has been wonderful. We're partnering with OneHE, and Olivia Fleming is our main partner there, along with Simon, and she's planned this week of incredible experts. And I want to tell you just a little bit about Olivia, her 17 years of experience working in the higher education sector. She's had a particular focus on key challenges facing higher education at the global level. She's passionate about supporting the sector and positioning itself as ways critical to the development of society for social good. She's a key strategic and change manager and thought leader, really excellent team builder, and is very focused on international environment with the knowledge of higher education sector on a global level. So welcome, Olivia, and all of your panelists today. We're really delighted to have you here joining the Global Minded Virtual 2021 event.
Thank you so much, Carl, and thank you to you and Global Minded for giving the space for us this week. This evening, I will say this evening because I'm coming from the UK, we have a fantastic panel covering 5 time zones across the world. And it's just going to be hopefully a really interesting discussion. So I'm just going to introduce everybody and then just give you a little about OneHE, and then we'll move into the discussions. So we have today, we have Hilligje van Land. Dr. Hilligje van Land is the Secretary General of the International Association of Universities, a global NGO with UNESCO associate status. For the past 2 decades, she has fostered the key role of higher education in societal transformation. She supervises the overall program activities of the IAU, develops the association's strategic plans, and oversees the everyday work of the Secretariat. She positioned the IAU as partner in UNESCO's work on education for sustainable development, in the UNESCO Futures of Education Initiative, and higher education as a key stakeholder for the UN Agenda 2030, which is transforming our world. Hilligje strongly believes in the importance of international cooperation and the intercultural understanding, and has developed multilateral projects related to higher education and beyond. She represents IAU in various working groups and expert committees, including at the Council of Europe and UNESCO. She is also on the advisory board of UVAD, Test, the Observation of Academic Freedom, and of course, she sits on the OneHE advisory group as well. Hilligje holds a PhD in comparative Francophone literature, speaks 6 languages, and publishes on higher education issues of relevance locally and globally. Most recent book is, as a co-editor, is Higher Education's Response to COVID-19. So welcome, Hilligje. And here we have Dr. Eddie Watson. Eddie is the Chief Information Officer and Associate Vice President for Curricular and Pedagogical Innovation at the Association of American Universities and Colleges and Universities. He leads the association's state-level advocacy and policy efforts to advance quality in undergraduate student learning and guides the AAC&U's agenda to advance educational quality initiatives within institutions, state systems, and state-based consortia. He also directs AAC&U's Institute on e-portfolios, the Institute on Open Educational Resources, and the Forum on Open Learning and e-portfolios, and co-directs the Institute on General Education and Assessment and the Conference on General Education, Pedagogy and Assessment. Additional areas of interest include curricular and pedagogical improvement efforts, and he is leading the development of assignment design tools, which aligns with AAC&U's value rubrics. Prior to joining AAC&U, Dr. Watson, I like saying Dr. Watson, was the director for the Center for Teaching and Learning at the University of Georgia. He continues to serve as a fellow in the Institute for Higher Education at UGA. He is the founding executive editor of the International Journal of e-portfolios and executive editor of the International Journal of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, and is on the board of directors of the International Society for Exploring Teaching and Learning and the Association for Authentic, Experiential and Evidence-Based Learning. His most recent books are Teaching Naked Techniques, A Practical Guide to Designing Better Classes, and Playing to Learn with Reacting to the Past, Research on the High Impact Active Learning Practices. Eddie recently joined the OneHE advisory group at OneHE, and AACU last week announced a collaboration to provide affordable, flexible faculty development at scale across North America. So OneHE and AAC&U working together, and we're excited about that. And welcome Warren. Warren is a globally connected higher education professional and reformer with extensive leadership experience across EdTech, strategy, marketing, business development, and partnerships, principally in the last mile learning institutions positioned to scale. An educated, a results-orientated leader, he focuses on opportunities that leverage robust expertise in university, industry, government relationships, institutional and academic innovation, and university-led economic development, including the future of work, scale, and value-based engagement. An advocate for contemporary, majority online education, he is committed to giving higher education a stronger voice in society, notwithstanding its responsibility to lift the overlooked towards economic and social standing. Warren is the founder and senior advisor at ConnectEd. ConnectEd is a collective of motivated interdisciplinary education professionals. A for-profit, for-good digital education business, ConnectEd is committed to providing those in higher education with the knowledge and applied skills to drive their respective organizations forward, and as such is a kindred spirit for OneHE. Warren is the podcast host of EdUp Experience podcast. It's a community of higher ed professionals dedicated to building a better higher education sector for all. He is an advisor to 3 organizations, InStride, Writer Higher Ed, and OPEDA. Prior to ConnectEd, Warren was the managing director of Kahoot Learning Academy and played a key role in the development of RMIT Online in Australia. So you can see today we have a fantastic and very varied panel to take forward discussions. So just a little, I'll wake up my computer, sorry. A little note on OneHE. So OneHE, what we do is we help educators develop their teaching practice. And we do this by providing practical and engaging micro-learning on effective teaching in a safe and supportive global learning community. And for all of you attending today, we're offering access to the platform free of charge up until the end of July. So please use the link below to access that offer. So let's move on and hear from our 3 impressive panelists today. Each panelist is going to talk for approximately 10 minutes, and then we're going to open up the discussion for you to ask any questions. And if you want, please let us know where you've come from through the chat, but also post the questions into the Q&A sections. So I'm going to start and hand over to Hilligje.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you tonight for us on this side of the globe. Indeed, it is already 10 o'clock at night. I'm very pleased to be with you and to be able to discuss the future of higher education. And I've been invited to shed some light on what we see from where I sit. So thank you, Olivia, for the wonderful presentation. Thank you, Carol, for the opening, and for connecting Global Minded and OneHE. And Warren, I use your title to connect. So please go to the next slide. As I would like to actually, before defining the future of higher education, recall one of the major questions that we should ask ourselves. If we want to design a future higher education, and then we should ask ourselves, what kind of a higher education do we need? And if we want to define that, we need to ask ourselves the question, what kind of a society do we want? And this is what I want to try and explain in my presentation. Next, please. So this is to the background, or what we're actually looking at is a university and its missions. And what are the most known missions of a university is teaching and learning and research. But since a few years, there's a lot of attention that's been given as well to community engagement. So 3 pillars upon which to develop the kind of university of today and also of the future. Next, please. So what is a university then? That is the question that we may ask ourselves if we are to look at the university of the future. Well, actually, we can go back a long way in the past in order to try and see where we go into the future. Indeed, a university is one of the oldest institutions that has survived the passage of time. It is an institution that's transformed, that has adapted itself along the way, and allows us to think about future opportunities for the many to benefit from. It's a strange body at the same time, because it is made up of tensions, and it is a combination of traditions, and thus the defense of a system that has been, and many opportunities arise every day to see how much of this tradition is being upheld by the institutions as we know them, made of brick and mortar. And yet they also work a long time, and all through time, to transform themselves, to become the kind of institutions that always are expected to help us lead ourselves into the future. And so they transform and thus have a difficulty to resist the invasion of alien norms, as Peter Maassen named them, because they adapt all the time efficiently to environmental changes, to new societal expectations, and to new demands. Next, please. There are so many types of institutions, so this is what we have to look at as well. And you will see that first I tried to make a little bit of a list of what kind of institutions that there are around the world, because we can never say there is one university that exists. I think even the 5 people that were here on the screen, we came from institutions that are extremely diverse. There's so many different types of universities from wherever you sit and wherever you've learned and wherever you've been able to develop yourselves. So there is a great variety on continents and between continents, in countries and between countries. There is a great variety between universities and a great variety between higher education institutions. And at the same time, there is a tension there again with another phenomenon that we see in many places, the harmonization processes. And the most known here in this part of the world, in Europe, is the EHEA, the European Higher Education Area, and the Bologna process that has traveled around the world as an example of how countries have come together, sat their ministers of education and higher education to think about a possibility to harmonize a system that is so diverse. And so there are some avenues in transforming, and the determinant factors of this harmonization revolves around everywhere the notions of funding, what kind of a funding, and also around the notions of governance structures. So what kind of governance structures do we have, and how can we clarify them, explain them, so that they can come together even better? So you have public universities, you've got private ones, private not-for-profit, you've got private for-profit, and then the size of an institution will define as well the type of institution you have, and then the mission, the vision, the strategic planning exercises. Next, please. Here, I wanted to show something that actually Olivia brought to my attention. This is a group, Holland IQ, that developed over time a series of research to actually look at the kind of scenarios that they saw. It's interesting, it's already a few years old, and it's even grown older due to the pandemic, because this is a study that was published in 2018. Yet the 5 scenarios that were then developed thanks to bottom-up and top-down research with many people from around the world actually came to the conclusion that there are many scenarios that we could envisage for the future. And the first one is one that talks to the transition that I showed in an earlier slide, where education as usual is one thing that we will see progressing into the future. But then from there, we see many other forms of higher education developing. And you see regional dynamics that I talked about. You see global giants coming up. And here again in Europe, we have 2 huge examples of interest to the discussion. You have the COMU, for instance, in France, which are this bundling of universities, not really in a fusion type of coming together of institutions, but they come together, they work together in order to form these new opportunities of teaching and learning and research that will make a difference. And you have the European alliances as well, across countries and across the continent, in order to form these new kinds of bodies where people can learn. And next to that, you have these peer-to-peer experiences, and OneHE is a very good example of that, with excellent people coming into virtual spaces, yet offering a very human approach to this learning together. And you have the robotization of our associations, the digital transformations, the AI coming in. And all these scenarios actually live together already today and are leading us into the future. Next, please. So there are many global pressures that you see in these scenarios as well. And there are 3 that are here to be mentioned, as they will define our discussion later on as well. The first one is this global growth and expansion of our universities, and they impact in particular the teaching and learning dimensions. And they've called the university to add this 3rd dimension that I talked to earlier, the community engagement one. So there is a huge population growth, and that will be exponential in the years to come. And the sector will have to adapt to that. So the future university will be different due to that. The second pressure to transform are the developments of society, to which universities are actually expected to respond, and even more so to anticipate to. So they have in anticipation to provide for new ways to look at the world and to look at how to mitigate the local pressures with the global. Next, please. Higher education needs to actually prepare for the people for a new world. They have to look at how the job market is transforming. And I understand that Warren will talk to that as well. And all of that is a great uncertainty in which universities have to navigate today. They try to address it, they do their best, but still it is very complex. So these pressures come with different governance opportunities, the governance from the government, but governance internally, the different policies that are developed internally and externally, the business model pressures that the universities themselves push for, but also that society pushes on the universities, the value systems that are at stake, what kind of values, what is it that we want, the societal demands, including the student demands that have come in much more strongly than ever before. Then this tension between a true education and the training notion. What is it? Do we train for a market? Do we educate for society? Then the societal solidarity that has come up very strongly very recently, and we can think about, for instance, the Black Lives Matter issues in the US, where there is a huge transformation that is coming about and where universities are called to really transform. And then this notion of sustainability, transformation, yet always the need to adapt and to innovate. Next, please. So the universities, they transform and they have reforms that come on to them. They have documents that document all of that. But what Peter Maassen, again, I mentioned him earlier, is also noting is that all these dynamics of the transformation today forget maybe about one thing. It is that the university has to develop as well as a humanistic body, as a social body, as a solidarity body, and that it has to ensure that it will contribute to the development of a vivid public sphere. And so these tensions, again, transform the university, where they have to be efficient on the one hand, they have to respond to the many calls from governments, from society at large, and yet they have to offer everything at the same time. So this is a multiplication of missions and things imposed on them. Next, please. A very quick slide, or a very dense slide, but where I will go fast. There are many challenges that came with COVID, because that's also interesting to look at in our discussion. The challenges that came with reduced mobility, financial crisis, loss of interest for the higher education sector, a participation crisis. But we've seen at the same time that this was also an opportunity to look at things, how universities work, and the opportunities came thanks to the digital transformation of the higher education bodies, where they resisted initially, now they don't anymore. There's increased access, there's more opportunity for equality, there is a contribution to sustainable development that is possible through the very many dynamics that are coming into play within an institution. And then there is this global engagement that has to be rethought anew with further local relevance. And one of the important topics here on this slide is the notion of cooperation against competition, because people have seen that we are facing a global pandemic, and maybe it is about time that we work together in a different way, not only on health issues, but on societal issues, on issues of that matter, in order to generate the kind of society we want through the education that we wish. So the last slide almost is the next one, where again, what then are the strategies that we have to put in place if we want to consider ever being able to construct or to co-construct a new kind of universities? Of course, new developments, transformations, but these come with challenges that we've seen and as many opportunities to match them. But these transformations are ongoing. We also have to be careful with a body that is already very agile and adaptive for so many centuries. And these transformations need to be co-constructed with everybody on board. And we will see that there are many models. So these scenarios that we've seen that have been suggested by Holland IQ, for instance, and many others out there, but there will be many models that will need to live one next to each other in order to be able to also respond to the expectations and to the expected outcomes of higher education. But what will be interesting to discuss is, are these expectations and the expected outcomes shared? Do we all want the same from the education systems that we know? And again, then, we have to ask ourselves collectively, what kind of a society do we want? And then once we will know that, we will be able to develop the university of the future that we need. Next slide for some references that you will be able to look at later if you're interested. And then the final one to just thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hilligje. And I think an awful lot there. And it's a big question, you know, what type of society do we need? And then how does higher education respond to that? And of course, there will be different reactions to that. And also, of course, we've got the experience now with the pandemic about the speed at which certain universities have reacted and certain that haven't reacted so well. So maybe that's an interesting discussion going forward. I'd like to hand over now to Eddie Watson and take some perspective from him. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and thank you and Carol for both inviting me to be a part of this event. Really valued the conversation thus far, and I think that my points that I'm going to make are very much situated within sort of the broader landscape that my colleague in France just defined for us. So as I was thinking through this particular topic and thinking about maybe looking back a bit to look forward to think about what the future should lead us to, I kind of found myself, rather than thinking about what the future might be, to thinking about what the future of higher education must be. What are the challenges that we must respond to? So I'm hoping to provide a number of concrete examples that certainly very true within the US, but I think a lot of different higher education sectors around the globe, this will resonate with you. So next slide, please. So I'll begin with this larger question: what are higher education's greatest challenges? Which led me to really define three. Next slide, please. I think the three greatest challenges, especially within the context of the United States, I must say that I'm kind of couching my comments within the domain of student learning, student success, and faculty and their success in the service of student learning and student success. So not necessarily talking about research practice or larger business practices for the most part, but really within that framework, what should our future be? So thinking about the big challenges again, well, one of the big challenges is getting students into college, getting students to persist in college, and then to indeed attain the degree. Ideally, all at a similar rate. And of course, in the States, we measure often by 4- and 6-year graduation rates. Those are often things that are reported to accreditors and the like. So one big challenge, completion, attainment. Another big challenge is the quality of learning. That yes, we want students to complete and complete on time, but we also want students to learn a lot along the way, that the degree does indeed still have value. And kind of a companion to those big challenges is the notion of college affordability, the cost of college today. So big challenges. So let's look at each of those a little bit more at greater depth. So the first challenge of completion. So it is about persistence. It's about keeping students in school. It's about closing attainment gaps. In other words, regardless of ethnicity, we would hope that our practices and our programs would lead to students persisting and graduating at similar rates. And of course, there's also the notion of an inclusive classroom, that we have equitable classroom practices as well as equitable business practices. So next slide, please. So just looking back at attainment levels over, say, the past few decades, we see that students of color are achieving or attaining college degrees by the age of 25 at a far lower rate than white students. So ideally, our practices, of course, we can't overcome every social ill that exists in society, but we certainly could do a lot to maybe help close these attainment gaps and those practices that support that notion. Next slide, please. Not only should we be trying to close attainment gaps because it's indeed the right thing to do, but we also see the future enrollment of higher education, at least in the United States, the demographics are changing dramatically. And as we look forward, we see that those that are likely to be coming to higher education, it's a very different set of demographics. So if the demographics shift and we're not serving those students of color very well, then it's a really dangerous, I mean, there's a number of different ways to kind of think about this, whether you're thinking about it from a capitalist perspective and how well you're producing people for employability, which I imagine Warren's going to touch on a little bit as we go forward. But it's also thinking about being in service to the democracy. So next slide, please. The challenge of quality of learning. So we need more adaptable graduates who have achieved higher order learning outcomes. So being able to think integratively, to have achieved specific learning outcomes that we know are valuable for lifelong learning as well as employability, such as critical thinking, being able to work well in teams, to speak well. So oral communication, written communication, those are among the outcomes that we should be striving to provide our students as they graduate from college. Next slide, please. Indeed, we've seen a shift in the expectations from an employability perspective regarding what employers are looking for. Previously, some of the more prized skills were skills associated with doing routine manual tasks or routine cognitive tasks. But really, as the information age came into place, we found that employers are looking for graduates who can work well with new information and can also solve unstructured problems. So how do we prepare our graduates to actually solve unstructured problems? Those are among the pedagogical problems that we need to grapple with. Next slide, please. In addition to the challenge of ensuring our students have achieved higher order learning outcomes, there's a new challenge that's been emerging really for several years, but there's been a massive acceleration during the time of COVID. We've seen cheating at college has become far easier than ever before, given that venture capital has supported a number of new tools that are available on the landscape that students are using. I took screen grabs from just the last couple of months from headlines from Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, US News and World Report, and CNBC that have highlighted some of the big challenges associated with it. Talking to almost anyone on a college campus that's involved with the honor system, we're hearing that there have been triple or quadruple the number of cases that have been brought into the honor system at many, many universities within the states. So this is something that needs to certainly be addressed. Next slide, please. So often people talk about this quality imperative, but we see it as just as urgent as the attainment shortfall, especially within the context, again, of higher education in the United States. We see it as two rails on exactly the same track. Yes, we need to help students attain, but we also need to ensure that the degree, number one, means something, that there's integrity in the degree, but that students are also indeed achieving those higher order learning outcomes. Next slide, please. So affordability, this is indeed a big challenge, the cost of higher education these days. In fact, my son just a couple of weeks ago texted me the image on the right side of my slide here. University bookstore worker stole $20,000 worth of textbooks. And then of course the response is, oh man, I hope they recovered both of the books. So certainly textbooks have increased in their cost, but that's certainly not the major driver for the cost of higher education. It's certainly tuition. Next slide, please. I think many of you have seen graphs similar to this regarding the cost of higher education. And as a sort of a Monday morning armchair economist, you're always kind of, when you see a graph, you're looking for the bend, the hockey stick, if you will, in the graph. And if you look at this graph specifically about the US, you see around 2000, 2001, 2002, that's whenever the cost of tuition, the cost of higher education really began to accelerate. And there's definitely something that took place then. There was a systematic defunding of higher education from states, really across all 50 states, that led to this kind of growth. And I'll talk more about that here in just a second. Next slide, please. But when you hear about the rising cost of higher education, there are companion graphs associated with student debt. And we've seen that student debt has almost tripled over the last 15 years in the United States, which has a number of different ramifications for students and life beyond college. Next slide. So a little bit more in-depth analysis of exactly why we've seen such a growth. So what we're seeing here in this certainly very messy graph is along the left-hand side across a 5-year period during a previous economic downturn, so about 2008 to 2013. On the left represents bars for the amount of tuition dollars per student that states decrease funding per student. And on the right side is the blue graphs are the increase in tuition that was then charged to students in response. So I've got some arrows here. I'm going to go drill down a little bit to talk about some specific states. So I was in Georgia previously. They're kind of high on both sides of the graph. New York is a state that many have visited, and they're a little bit lower on the graph. So if you go to the next slide, what I want to highlight is across this 5-year period, Georgia received across all of its state schools, 25, 26 state schools within the system, received just over $3,000 less in state funding per student. And in response, collectively, the state schools raised tuition at about $2,900 total per student. So actually, while there's been a huge increase in tuition costs and the cost of higher education, which is often sort of placed at the feet of individual institutions, we can see the cause and effect here. So state decreased by $3,000, the individual institutions per student increased by $2,900. In Georgia, they lost a little bit of ground across those 5 years. New York, there was less of a cut, but there was also far less of a tuition increase. And so actually state schools per student lost $500 per student. So when you look across the entirety of the schools within, say, the state of New York or the state of Georgia, that amounts for a significant defunding of the state schools, even with the increases in tuition. So next slide, please. So this cost shifting from the public to individual students and their families has made cost rather than either completion or the quality of learning the dominant public concern. I have 2 sons, one's 20, one's 21, and one's graduated, one's in the middle of college right now. And indeed, as they've grown up and we've talked with their friends and their friends' parents, that's definitely what they're talking about. They're not necessarily talking about equity and equitable practices. They're not necessarily talking about quality of learning and the quality of the degree. It's like, well, how are we going to pay for this? How do we cost share with our student to ensure that there's not a massive amount of debt whenever they graduate from college? So there's definitely a shift in mindset around higher ed as a result of this. So next slide, please. So the future, were we ever going to get there? So the future must hold for higher education a range of things. One is that institutions must seek to develop a portfolio of solutions that address completion, attainment, and equity, as well as affordability, as well as quality. And indeed, most universities are working in this direction at this point as well. And fortunately, solutions that are available on the landscape and that are emerging don't have to be mutually exclusive. In other words, there's solutions out there that address more than just one of these, not just a completion strategy, but actually employing this addresses completion, equity, affordability, things like that. So what are some of the best practices out there? AAC&U has a set of practices that we recommend. There's 11 high impact educational practices that are curricular and pedagogical practices, which include experiential learning strategies such as service learning or undergraduate research, integrative learning strategies such as employing e-portfolios or a rich capstone experience for the major or even for the general education experience. So there are those practices that have been shown not only to deepen learning, but also help close attainment gaps. Students who participate in high impact practices, especially earlier in their educational experience, tend to catch up to students who may have been better prepared for college than say students that weren't. We're also seeing that open educational resources speak to multiple of these grand challenges these days. There's also a need to improve faculty practice and to improve advising. And there's some excellent strategies on the landscape these days that speak to improving faculty practice. Specifically, OneHE is a great example of this, that not only improves faculty practice, which we know then improves student success, but it's also a very affordable strategy that enables scaling to reach every member of the teaching faculty on a campus. So very excited about our partnership at AAC&U with OneHE because of the great promise that OneHE provides for addressing these great challenges for higher education. And there's also opportunities to leverage data. We're seeing this done in terms of predictive analytics or courseware, adaptive learning courseware, that really has an eye toward not only learning, but taking things to scale, which then has some affordability benefits. There's also some policy opportunities that we have, that higher education attainment must return as a public good, that we need to reinvest at the state level in our state colleges and universities to decrease the saddling of our graduates with exceptional debt. And there's also opportunities for policy and indeed law to be put in place to manage some of the academic integrity threats. Indeed, I was talking to a colleague recently who had investigated in this space and said that there were 16 states that had pretty clear laws regarding what companies can and can't do within college settings, which means the vast majority of the states don't have law within that space. So lots of opportunities around policy, lots of opportunities around rich practices to take us into the future. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Olivia.
Thank you very much. And I think just bringing forward what Hilligje talked about with regard to how do we define what the future of higher education looks like, when first we need to design what type of society we need. But I think through your discussion there, Eddie, there's a question, where does the responsibility sit in relation to who picks that up? And I can see a discussion very much from what has happened before is, back to the public, back to the state, back to government policy. But maybe there's another way, and that's why I'm going to hand over to Warren to take forward his perspective on what's going on and what the future may look like in this area.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I'm going to try and get through it as quickly as possible, because I think the fun will be in the conversation. So, but thank you very much for having me on. ConnectEd is really a marketplace for ideas at the intersection of education, technology, and sustainability. And if you kick to the next slide, I'll take you through the areas we're trying to focus on that relates to this conversation. So we know, and it's been evidenced today by many of the conversations that have been had thus far, that education is quintessential for our success. It's been an instrumental part of our change and progress that we've developed in society thus far. And we need it to prepare our future generations, both for work, but also for to have a better society ongoing. What we found is that the sector itself is not exempt from internal reformulation, and that's the area we're focusing on. So next slide, please, Olivia. So the problems we're focusing on is that higher education is obviously in an incredible state of flux. The education incumbents themselves need to keep up, and there's several new actors, models, and various kinds of advents that are trickling through and gaining a lot of momentum that we want to be able to prepare the traditional higher education sector for. There's a hell of a lot of new technology, of course, that's entering the fray, and also the business model of higher education is being fundamentally disrupted. And amid all of this complexity, we're finding that in the conversations that I've been having, that traditional universities and colleges are relatively ill-equipped to be able to prepare for the future, but also we want to inject a degree of confidence and training and skills for them to thrive in the future. So if you skip over to the next slide, please, Olivia. These have been stated to some extent, but the World Economic Forum put out a couple of challenges that they saw in higher education, and it's really this increasing need for lifelong learning in a non-linear world speaks to the fact that we are going through rampant change. The pace of change is absolutely astronomical, and the fourth industrial revolution is bringing about new changes that we need to apply to our workforce, but also it is no longer sufficient to say that we will be doing a bachelor's qualification or entering the college system and then forgetting about learning. It's certainly never going to be the case again that situation exists. We're going to be dipping in and out of learning over a 60-year curriculum that has been stated quite broadly, and it means that we're going to have to rekindle our desire and love of learning that we have as young kids, and carry on that enthusiasm throughout our life. the expectations of the customer and the student, whether you want to call them a customer or a student of our services, they are changing fundamentally. We see that obviously getting to the access points that have been raised earlier, people need to study at a time that suits them. We're seeing disruption to the calendar, as well as when students are doing their studies, as well as how they're doing their studies. And we're seeing a lot of advance in AI and personalization, whereby a student can get a very customized and student-centric view on their curriculum and their learning. And then we're seeing new technologies and business models emerging. And if you look at the extreme gaps in the ability to pay for tuition and the rising tuition costs, we're seeing very interesting models there disrupting the traditional higher education system, being things like income share agreements that are your earn while you learn kind of concepts. If you look at InStride and Guild and other organizations that I have the privilege to speak with regularly, they're looking at interesting ways to look at tuition reimbursement dollars to get many more people educated within the workforce itself. And then there's a notable shift towards skills over degrees. So we're seeing the competency-based education models rearing their head. We're seeing much more of a emphasis being placed on by an employer of the skills and competencies that you have relative to the degree or where you studied as being the more important thing moving forward, which obviously brings up the question of how do we assess those skills and competencies and be able to showcase those to the world. So if you skip to the next slide for me, please, Olivia. So my second concluding slide, and as I said, I do want to get to the conversation, but where I see the big opportunities and the area that I've had most experience with is through partnerships and training. What has become evident, and I'm a big fan of HolonIQ, and Patrick is an advisor to me and a really wonderful human being. So please follow his work. They do some outstanding stuff in the market. But one thing that's abundantly clear is that there's adequate support for higher education, colleges and universities, the traditional ones anyway, to partner. There's a huge amount of capital that's been made available into the EdTech community, and this term that they refer to at HolonIQ as OPX, I refer to it pretty much as OP everything. So this online program management support that's across the value chain. As we start unbundling the higher education services, we're starting to see a myriad of different providers that are coming in to support higher education transition, but also to take away some of the challenges that are best served, or better served, I should say, is more accurate, by private enterprise. And then if we look to the right-hand side, bridging the gap between higher education and gainful employment, we're seeing a great deal more attention being focused on the majority of students who are looking to enter the college and university system for a job at the end as their primary outcome. And so we're seeing some interesting models and different ways of thinking about how we transition our students from the undergrad traditional coming of age experience into the workforce. And these are some of the brands that I'm following. I'll mention just two of them because just again conscious of time, but if we look at Fourth Rev, for example, they're an outfit, good friends of mine that are starting to bake in to their programs industry credentials, so the likes of AWS, Salesforce, Google, Apple, others, and Adobe. And what they do is they obviously provide certification that a student now can exit their qualification, but also in hand, they have a industry certification that gives them the edge from an employability perspective, and they license these curriculum to universities and colleges the world over. Brandon Bustede, someone I follow a hell of a lot, speaks about cred degrees, and this is kind of an extension of that. Lambda School, as you may be familiar with, does income share agreements as well through Demo Education, and what they do is they prepare you for a job, and they do that for free and get a clip on the ticket as you enter the employment. So there's various different models that are emerging today. Entry level is another one that's doing virtual internships, and so again, almost free training, build a portfolio of evidence, and be able to surface that to an employer who's waiting on the other side of this exchange to take you up into the employment into the world of work. And then training, as was pointed out in the conversation as well, Brighter Higher Ed, OneHE, EduCourse, Inside Higher Ed, Chronicle, all of them are doing important work in upskilling higher education professionals, broadly defined, to kind of thrive in the future of work. And this is certainly an area where Connect Ed has been focusing. We want to provide the tools and expertise and insights and provide the wherewithal for organizations to thrive in the future of work. And so our programs support that. And then in the bottom left-hand side, we're seeing huge advances in neuroscience, and we could see this as being a very much a disruptor to the traditional higher education system. If we look at it purely from a knowledge transfer point of view, we might be able to look at Neuralink plugging in into the internet and forcing that knowledge into your head, and that could be a very much a disruptor. But other work that's being done around this, playing on the periphery there, is huge advances in how we learn, and this is a very much a area that I'm focusing in on that will help our teaching and learning professionals down the track. So, sorry, next slide, and it's my final slide just to summarize. So some observations that I see, of course, it's very difficult to say when these things are going to happen, but I just looked in 4 buckets and I said, what would I think about from the traditional university and college experience? So as mentioned by both previous speakers, the higher education's purpose is certainly being looked at. Is there going to be a delineation of research and teaching and splitting those out? And I loved Hilligje's reference to the community aspect, which I believe is going to become increasingly important. There's certainly changing incentives that are taking place in some of the local universities here in Australia around tenure and how that works. And also the ranking system. So if you look at the Times Higher Education, the QS rankings and so on, there's a significant amount of work, and I believe a significant amount of work is needed to change our ranking systems and what they measure and why they measure them, so that we can move away from this Harvardization of education, but rather look at it in a different way. And then mainstream diversity, equity, and inclusion. Certainly that's a movement that I believe is going to gain a hell of a lot of momentum and needs to. And then again, this partnership space, we're seeing all kinds of interesting partnerships in higher education. I'm seeing universities partner with private organizations, universities obviously buying private organizations and incorporating those much more in the boot camp space, much more in this credit degree space, as I said, and the OPMs are obviously having a field day at the moment, and also looking to reinvent their business model to something that's arguably more ethical and more transparent. And then we're seeing mostly in the US a severe heightened competitive landscape. So there's no doubt that we're going to see a lot more in terms of branding, digital marketing, and new kind of ways of finding university niches and nuances to promote those to the market. And then also contemporary ways of working. So working with speed, being much more agile and innovative, not looking at a waterfall approach of saying, here's the perfect curriculum that we've developed and the perfect course and putting that on a shelf, but rather how can we iterate this over time and give a minimum viable product for the foreseeable future, so that we can move quickly and adapt our coursework to what is required in the field of work. So industry certification in the future work, not going to go into too much detail here because I have mentioned this before about skills becoming more and more important, less organizations on aggregate starting to look at higher education qualifications as being a meaningful entry into employment, but rather looking at what competencies and skills do you have, and then learning in the flow of work. STEM and liberal arts. So lots of conversations here. I strongly believe, and we're starting to see very big signs of it, is that your STEM programs are becoming much more apparent at many universities and colleges the world over. And I believe we're going to see a new liberal arts education coming to bear, where we look at our interaction with machines, the changing world of work to being one much more of automation. And so how do we see the problem solving skills, critical thinking, and leadership really being focused on much more intently in all of our programs. And then lastly, to conclude, I mentioned the rising up of competency-based education, certainly in the conversations I've had with many US providers in particular. And then this modern type assessment, or notwithstanding all the challenges that were cited earlier by Eddie around cheating, but there's going to be a great deal more emphasis being placed on assessment. And I believe that the institutions that get that right are honestly going to have a tremendous first mover advantage, because we need to start revisiting and moving away from high stakes exams into more peer-to-peer and portfolio of evidence-based assessment. And then more emphasis on informal learning, the likes of Degreed and others who are looking at the articles that you're reading, looking at the investment that you put into conversations like this, and how do we aggregate that up into a more holistic view of a student and what they're capable of achieving. And some organizations like Credential Engine and others are doing wonderful work in aggregating that up so that we have a better understanding globally of what these credentials mean. So I flew through it, but really, as I said, we're short on time.
Great, thank you so much. An awful lot in there, Warren, I have to say. I'll just take you back to a point that you made there around the skills and competencies versus really the critical thinking that can come from the liberal arts side. And probably this is a question to all the panelists: how do we get that balance right when the whole system is going into flux? And so that we don't see that we're just producing people for jobs that have certain skills, but to go back to Hilligje's point at the beginning, that we have to actually decide the society we want, and therefore we need to be teaching, we need to have graduates that are critical thinkers. So how do we get that balance right? And moving forward, you know, what are the ways of doing that? So hand back to who wants to answer that first.
I'm off mute, so I'll just take an initial stab at it. I don't have the answer, and I think it's a very difficult one. I'm also deeply concerned about it. It's probably one of the things I'm most concerned about in the world is seeing the likes of Google and AWS and Microsoft and others offering up certifications that are very technical in their nature and guaranteeing employment, and there may or may not be a mismatch between the skills and competencies that these individuals have to actually perform and thrive beyond that technology, because technologies change, and what have we done to prepare this working professional to adjust and move on to a different career and be able to pivot and provide them with those skills. So I'm concerned about that. In the main, these courses have been offered to working professionals already, so hoping that they have some experience under their belt for them to be able to pivot their career and so on. But if we're looking at a young individual who's just left the school system, there's some onus on the K-12 environment to prepare students better at that stage of their learning. And I believe we're going to see hopefully a lot more of that, moving away from some of the redundancy in that system in the K-12 environment, and to start preparing those skills earlier. And then as I do see a hope, I would love to see a world where we all exit our school leaving environment into a kind of liberal arts education as a short interim bridge gap between that and employment, and then get the technical skills on top of that. So that's just my wishful thinking, but that's how I would see it.
And just because it kind of follows a little bit of how the US system works, Eddie, do you want to respond on that?
Well, it's not an easy question. I was just thinking about the notion of, you know, what's the society that we want? And as was mentioned earlier, in the US, we very much are experiencing having an important conversation around Black Lives Matter. But I think as we've seen in our most recent election, I don't think that we're necessarily that close to having societal agreement about the society that we want to have. I think most nations are in sort of similar places. So for me, grappling with that question as a starting point, it's the logical starting point, but I don't think it's the starting point for bringing about change, just because it's such a difficult, it has an arc that's probably decades rather than months or years. So I guess I would sidestep that issue and sort of focus back on the notion for me of like, what can we do best for our students? How can we do best by our students? And part of it is about learning. It's about preparing them for the job markets, preparing them for, I think it was Warren that said the idea of the curriculum is really a 60-year arc of curriculum. I think I'll probably borrow that phrase in the future, is that is indeed what we should be preparing our students for as they leave college, is not the end of the journey, but maybe the end of the first chapter of the journey.
Okay, and Hilligje.
But what I find interesting here as well is that there is an assumption that we know what the world of work is actually developing into, or what it is. And at the same time, I think it was you, Warren, who stressed that most, that with the transformation of the world of work, even the jobs that we prepare the students for today will not exist tomorrow. And so higher education in itself cannot prepare for the world of work. It can prepare the students to be equipped with competencies, and I would go way beyond skills, but competencies and knowledge and critical thinking and understanding and art and an understanding of where they come from, the history, the past, the future, something that is much broader than something that would prepare them for the world of work. The world of work is something that is in such a vague concept today that how to prepare them for that. If you have a recipe for it, wonderful, but I don't think there is one, especially today where so much is transforming when it comes to the labor market itself. And so if we would go back somehow, maybe it's not the word back that works, but to the essence of what a university is for. We can have high schools, we can have all of those, that is a different track. But if we want to think about the future of higher education and then agree that higher education is not elitist, but an opportunity to really develop and become a better person that can contribute to developing a better society, then we need to go way beyond the world of work. Work is essential. It's part of our lives, and it's part of that journey. Maybe one stop shot there, but there's so much more. So if we have an opportunity to really educate citizens that will make the difference, and connect the dots and address the challenges. And also, I think both of you use the term complexity of our world. We need to have the opportunity to educate any student coming through a higher education system to address the complexity of this world, to understand it, to untangle it, to analyze it in order to contribute to the development of the solutions that we need. And we need them now. We don't need them in 10, 20, 30 years. That will be too late. So the job market, yeah, I have some resistance to that, and the world of work as it is. I am also convinced that the students that we see around us in our families, in our homes, in our streets and everywhere, they will invent the jobs of tomorrow. They will invent something new. They will develop, but to do so, they need to be incredibly knowledgeable of the world in which we live. They need to know about the US, they need to know about Australia, they need to know about the UK, they need to know about Italy, France, everything. They need to know about culture, they need to know about the evolution of things. And I think we need to give them that. We need to give them the opportunity to educate themselves into well-rounded, knowledgeable people who will have an understanding of the many things around us: nature, culture, industry, business, everything, but in a comprehensive way. And that's why I love the liberal arts education that was promoted most in the Anglo-Saxon world. It's coming a little bit to the more Latin world, but less so. And this flexibility, we need to look at interdisciplinarity. We need to look at new ways of offering the opportunity to make these connections that we require in order to become what we use, all of us, but with different definitions, I think, or perceptions of it, but the critical thinkers. And you can be a critical thinker only if you have a very broad knowledge base upon which to stool that critical thinking. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, we're getting out of time, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I know we could take this discussion on. And one thing I totally agree with is what we have to do is we have to teach all students how to learn. And if we teach students how to learn, then, you know, the change will come, and the change that we need in order to deal with the big issues that we have in society. There's going to be disruption. There are going to be different modes of delivery of how we do. And the one thing that I would say is change is coming, it's coming fast, but it's interesting, and we will see different models come up across the world, and we'll see which works best in different contexts. But I think the most important thing is we keep the conversation going, and we also look and support those that want to do and be part of that change. So I would like to thank the panel very much for your insight into this very interesting discussion, and hopefully we'll take it forward in a different form somewhere else. I'll hand back to Carol and just to close down, but thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Olivia. Thanks to all of you. And would like to say that at Global Minded, we say the future of work is diverse, inclusive, just, and equitable. And I think if we don't start to more discreetly define that in a definite way, we won't get that unless we're really focused on that. So I want to also say that tomorrow we have another session. It's Equity Unbound, Building Online Communities. And on Friday, Person-Centered and Inclusive Learning, also part of the OneHE week. Next week, we'll be working with the National Science Foundation every single week next week, every single day next week with many, many people. And instead of one session a day, we'll be doing multiple sessions every single day with the NSF partners. And the following week, we have our health equity team the entire week. Very diverse health leaders looking at health career pathways, looking at some of the fallout from the pandemic this year and how we're going to be able to address those things for populations who have been most impacted by those things. And then finally, for our last week, we've got our first gen leadership class, which is virtual, and we'll have people from different parts of the world and connecting those students with role models, mentors, internships and jobs, and in introducing those students to some of the people who have graduated from our program who are now out working in many different types of industries, and they'll be sharing their insights from that vantage point. So thanks to all of you. Thanks for those of you who joined us. I know somebody asked in the chat, where do we get the YouTube? And Simon, thank you for posting that. And we look forward to working with all of you in the future to make that future of work and the future of our world and society diverse, inclusive, just, and equitable. So thanks to each of you, and good night for those of you in the time zone, and good morning, people just waking up. And so glad that we were able to spend this time together. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.